I want to introduce Alicia Danforth from UCLA. Alicia's going to talk on Little Pieces of a Big Dream, participants' stories from a cancer anxiety study with psilocybin. This woman is where the rubber meets the road because she works with patients who are dying and who are lucky enough to be involved with a program that can try to use psilocybin to ease their anxiety, and has been actually quite successful in doing so, and she'll detail that for you. Just a little bit about her bio then. Alicia is a clinical psychedelic researcher. Since 2006, she's coordinated and co-facilitated treatment sessions for Dr. Charles Grob's Harbor-UCLA cancer anxiety trial with psilocybin. She also oversees a nationwide web-based recruitment effort for a similar trial currently underway at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, always looking for subjects. Inspired by seeing firsthand how psychedelic therapy can relieve suffering, she began a Ph.D. program in clinical psychology at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto. In 2008, she was a speaker on the ɁRising Researchers panel at the World Psychedelic Forum in Basel, Switzerland. I'll turn you over to Alicia.
Thank you, Neil. Is my mic on? Everyone hear me?
Yep.
Good afternoon. Okay, to start, I'm curious to know how many people in the room have seen Jill Bolte Taylor's talk that she gave on TED about the insight she gained after having a stroke. Okay, for those of you who haven't seen it, she starts her talk by bringing out a human brain with a wiggly spinal cord dangling. And ever since I've seen that, when I think about approaching the beginning of a talk, I think, I got nothing. But I do. I brought something for you today, and I had several options to choose from. I could offer you some very interesting charts and graphs and data from the psilocybin trial. I will share with you that we have submitted the findings paper to a prestigious psychiatric journal. We decided, let's go for the best, let's shoot for the top, and to our amazement, we've made it through a few hurdles, and the manuscript is in peer review right now. So I'm hoping all of you shortly will have an opportunity to read all about the science end of things in the near future. At this point in my studies, I've also written a couple of scholarly papers. I could give you a PowerPoint presentation today with theory and big words. But then I remembered the macaroni and cheese. And I thought, I really want to talk to them today about the macaroni and cheese. So what I have to offer you are stories. Stories about this big collective dream that some individuals, like Charles Grob, they've kept it alive through decades of prohibition. And what I'm sharing with you today are a few glimpses of that dream coming true. In exchange for what I have to offer you, what I'd like to request, in addition to turning off your cell phones, is that you listen in a very embodied way. I know this is New York, but this is not going to be a particularly intellectual presentation. I want you to listen with your whole body, especially your heart. And be aware of any images that come to mind, memories that the stories provoke in you, and any bodily sensations. I want you to be aware of your whole person. So feel your feet on the floor, become fully present in the room, and I'm going to tell you some stories about the dream and what I've observed. One quick note. I'm going to be telling you stories about the participants who were in the trial. We worked with 12 people who had metastatic cancer. If you're curious to hear more about the protocol and the study design, how it proceeded, there are lots of good talks on the Psychedelic Salon podcasts and other places online. I would refer you there. I am going to be sharing stories about individuals, and I'm mindful of the requirements to maintain patient confidentiality. If you hear me refer to someone by name, it's because they have chosen to appear in the press, in the media, to tell their stories publicly. And a handful of these stories are bits of information that people who were dying, essentially, wanted our team to share with the broader psychedelic community and the world. So I am very mindful about respecting privacy, but these are stories the participants wanted told. So let's begin. So I thought about the whole array of things that we witnessed. I realized that our participants fell into broadly 3 interesting categories that really fascinated me. There were the first-timers, people who were psychedelic naive, who had never been high in their lives. They really had a special place in my heart. I thought they were so brave. There's another category I refer to as the transformers, people who went through a significant transition as a result of participating in this study. And the third category is the activists, people who found the experience so compelling that they invested their time and energy near the end of life in spreading the word and sharing their experience with other people. Okay, so I'm going to begin with just a couple of stories. I'm going to try to speak fairly quickly here to get through. The first story I heard was before I came on board. I came on board and worked with with 7 patients, but one of the 5 prior to when I joined the study was psychedelic naive. During the first session, nothing remarkable happened. The team and the participant assumed that must be the placebo. So during the second session, they were kind of anticipating that something would probably happen, and hours went by. By the 4th hour, nothing was happening. And someone got the idea, I think the music is a little too mellow. We need to bring up the energy. So Dr. Chopra, who was the fellow on the study, ran down to his car, and he got some Dead Can Dance. And they switched up the music, and about 20 minutes later, the floodgates opened, and the participant just started sobbing. And the team thought it best not to intervene at that time and just let her go through that process. But afterwards, they talked to her, and under the influence of psilocybin, we confirmed after we broke the blind that she allowed herself to feel the grief that she'd repressed, that she had never shared with her father while he was living, that she loved him. So that's just a glimpse of how powerful a first psilocybin experience can be for someone. This next anecdote is from another first-timer. This was a very reserved mother, church-going woman, never been high. She found our study because she was aware of Dr. Moreno's psilocybin trial and contacted that team. They said, because of your advanced cancer, you won't qualify for this study, so we'll refer you to Harbor-UCLA. And so she was looking to alleviate some OCD-like symptoms that she had. She wanted to improve the quality of her life with the time she had remaining. Her first session, again, team, the participant, we kind of mutually concluded that was probably the placebo. She said, if that was psilocybin, I'm not impressed. So at the beginning of her second session, she started curled up in the fetal position with her hands like this, with some anxiety about, I'm going to trip for the first time. What's this going to be like? And about 20 minutes later, she just opened up in the bed like a flower, spread eagle, hands over her head, and we could see that she just surrendered to this experience and went deep. It's funny, a bit into it, she started laughing to herself. And I made a note in the progress notes, ask her what she's laughing about afterwards. And what she was laughing about, she told me, well, I want to hear classical music and jazz when I have this experience. And I worked on the playlist and put in some music that's pretty good to trip to. And here's what she had to say about her experience with the music. She said, in the placebo event, I didn't want music on. It was difficult. She had some pain in her head that made it difficult for her to listen to music on headphones. Plus, I really didn't like the new age kind of music that was played. But when I was on the active drug, I really liked the music. And in fact, the Indian drumming, which I thought was kind of stupid the first time, intensified my experience under the active drug. It was kind of remarkable how this weird music I would never normally listen to became part of my trip. But it goes deeper than that, much deeper. towards maybe the last third of her experience, something started to happen that was the most profound moment I had personally as an observer. Here's an account from her perspective of what was happening. She said, I had an extremely deep, rich experience. The first feeling I had was happiness, and I smiled a lot, feeling that I knew life was to be taken this way. Soon after, I found my hands moving to certain parts of my body, hovering and moving on, repeating, and then resting. I did not feel connected to what was going on, but was aware of it. I even asked the people with me if I was indeed making the motions or if I was dreaming that I was. I do know that my experience in this altered state lasted quite a while, and when I was made aware that it was ending, I was disappointed. I was comfortable, not afraid, and in touch with something that made me happy. I cannot say directly what long-lasting effect the one study had on me, because I value science, and I don't think I can make assumptions on one experience. I would very much like to repeat the study and compare experiences. And we heard that repeatedly. People had a desire for a booster session to continue the work after they've had a period of time to do some integration work from the first session. What it looked like to us, those of us in the room observing, we were accustomed to people kind of twitching and kind of moving to the music a little in bed. But this particular participant started doing sequential hand motions on her body with a sort of mounting intensity. It was very unusual. And as I observed her, I noticed at every pass, first chakra, second chakra, third chakra, fourth, and then she did motions around her head that I've only seen Reiki masters do. As it intensified, there was an energy in the room that was extraordinary, and I leaned over to Dr. Chopra and I said, is this OCD? Is this like ritualized? And he says, it looks like energy healing to me, so I'll leave it to you to draw your own conclusions. When it came up to the point where we needed to take a blood pressure reading, I said, science tells me I need to go in there and write something in a chart. I'm not interrupting this. It felt mystical. And in an effort to understand what we'd observed afterwards, I wrote a note to Stanislav Grof, and he sent back an excerpt from some of his writing, and he said, oh yes, we observed this in our LSD studies. Participants would occasionally adopt yoga asanas or mudras. Our participant would rest periodically with her hands in the Chin mudra, which denotes receptivity to divine guidance. This is what she had to say. I didn't do a yoga practice or meditation practice where I used mudras. I'd seen the hand position in statues and paintings, but I didn't know its meaning. I was surprised myself that this hand position was the one that I was using in the movements while I was under the influence of psilocybin. She'd not been educated in yoga or in chakra energy centers. It was a very spontaneous experience. So that gives you an idea of how deep this work can go, even with someone who's never used a psychedelic before. Okay, I think I'm going to go a bit long on the first-timers at the expense of some of the other stories. I do want to tell you this one, because this one has some profound implications. One of our participants contacted me with a very strong desire to be in the study, but had some reservations because she'd made the decision several weeks prior to stop taking an antidepressant. She hadn't requested the antidepressant. Her doctors managing her cancer said, use this, it'll help you cope. She said, I don't want to take another pill. I don't need this. And she went off of it. Well, around the time she contacted us, she was starting to realize, I know what that medication was doing for me. I'm afraid if I have the placebo during my first session, I won't be able to hold out until I get the active drug. So we got approval to kind of condense the period of time to the minimum between her two sessions. And at the 1-month follow-up, she had a month that you just wouldn't believe. Radiation treatment for a cancer in her tongue, had just fried her mouth and throat so that she'd had to have a feeding tube inserted. She'd lost a friend in an accident, tragically and unexpectedly, and had discovered that a nagging pain in one of her joints was in fact a new metastases, which did not bode well in her case. And even though it was extremely painful for her to talk, she wanted to convey one important point to me on the phone. With a very slurred speech, she said, "Alicia, I have no desire whatsoever to go back on the Zoloft. I don't need it. And the only thing I can attribute it to is my psilocybin experience." And she remained off SSRIs until she died several months later. Okay, now to the macaroni and cheese. This is a story about one of our transformers. This is someone who went through a very amazing transformation to witness. We were very careful in recruiting to never give the impression that we were trying to treat the cancer. We knew individuals would have their own opinions about what the psilocybin may or may not do to affect the course of their disease progression. But it's easy sometimes when we're doing this work to focus on the mystico-spiritual. But here's another story about something that took place within the body. This particular participant had a head and neck cancer, and due to extensive radiation and surgery, her throat had atrophied, and she described it to me. It felt as if her throat was the size of an ordinary drinking straw, and she lost the ability to swallow, and the doctors told her this is not something you can expect will improve or get better. So she'd been living on a liquid diet, didn't want a feeding tube, so she could only drink clear liquids, couldn't have yogurt, applesauce, anything that thick. So she lived with a constant bodily hunger, that feeling of being near starvation. And this is what transpired shortly after her psilocybin experience. She writes, "For a short, amazing time, 2 weeks after that journey, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my fiancé. He'd baked yams and fish. I picked up a fork and put a bit of yam in my mouth and wanted to see if my throat would reject it as usual, sending me running to the sink. This time, I swallowed the yam, then some fish. My throat was a blossom opening. Every day, I would sit with a small meal, a scrambled egg, some cheese, something soft. It had been so long since I'd eaten anything solid, and I knew it was a gift. Soon enough, my throat began to atrophy again. And you can make your own decision. Did she always have that ability to swallow still remaining and the psilocybin just emboldened her? Or did the psilocybin have something to do with some healing that allowed her to eat for a while? The story didn't really sink deep into my bones until she told me, yams and fish wouldn't excite me very much, but the first thing she'd requested when she got so excited about the ability to swallow again was she wanted macaroni and cheese. So just think for a moment about what that would mean to have that ability to eat a comfort food again. Think about that connection between food and the soul, and things like macaroni and cheese that we take for granted. Just a little bit more to take it again to that deeper level. I'll read a brief summary of her journey. She says, "My journey was extraordinary. Though I have no doubt these altered states can be reached without drug enhancement, this research offer from Dr. Grob came at the perfect time for me. Meditation and concentration had become all but elusive since I'd been ill. Shifting attention away from the pain in my head and neck took every bit of my focus. But with the help of the mushroom, I was able to leap past the physical pain for a brief time and experienced a knowing that fills me daily with peace. I know that I'm not going into a void. There is a God and life continuing. I will miss terribly looking into the dear, dear faces of my children, but I will find ways to let them know I am, was, and always will be with them. And the real transformation that took place for this participant was the realization that her cancer would eventually take her life. She went into the study still with some fairly deep denial that she could beat this thing and work around the restrictions with eating, but she came to accept in a very peaceful sort of way that this would be a terminal illness for her. This is just one more brief excerpt that is written from the perspective of what was going through her mind during the experience. She says, "I ask what has been the point of my being here on earth. There is no one point. I am and was and always will be. I feel elucidated. I understand that it never really mattered what I did in terms of career, etc., just that I was living life to the fullest and that whatever I did reflected who I was. Though this is a foundation of nearly every spiritual belief system, hearing it again now in this way is so confirming and a burden lifted. I'd wished I'd had the faith to believe in this before. In the back of my mind all these years, I could shake the idea that I thought I had to accomplish something in order to be fulfilled or to fulfill God's plan. No such thing. I am, was, always have been enough." We had quite a few other transformers, but in the interest of time, I don't feel as if I can do their stories justice. I want to switch now to a category that I refer to as the activists. And you may have seen some of these people on the web. They've participated in documentaries, interviews for newspapers and magazines. The first woman who really came forward was also a transformer. She was consumed with anxiety to the point that she was canceling travel plans, just letting her life kind of grind to a halt. And during her session, she was able to let go of that anxiety. She kept the trip to Europe on the books, continued doing things she enjoyed. You may have seen her if you're familiar with Pam Sakuda. This is her story. On a Saturday night, Pam made a decision close to the end of her life to actually spend her last Saturday night speaking at a fundraiser for the Hefter Research Institute that funded the psilocybin study. And I sat next to Pam and her husband, and when it came time to dessert, she did that thing women always do. "Oh, should I get the cheesecake?" And her husband and I, we kind of nudged her and said, "Get the cheesecake." And we were at a beautiful restaurant in the Hollywood Hills. She was dressed in a lovely outfit. She had her hair. She spoke with passion about the importance of promoting sound, responsible clinical research with psychedelics. And she died peacefully at home on the Thursday that followed. I want to introduce to you now another activist, someone else you may be familiar with. She spoke here at a fundraiser for the psilocybin trial at NYU in June. She can tell her story far better than I can, so I'm going to play a brief clip. The woman you're about to meet is Annie Levy. She wanted to become a psychedelic psychotherapist, but at the point when she was starting her career, she didn't feel that that was an option available to her. She became a neuropsychologist, and after the study, organized an opportunity for Dr. Grob to come and speak to a large group of mental health professionals in a very mainstream healthcare organization. She's appeared in some magazine articles and some documentaries. You might want to note this down. On November 3rd, National Geographic Explorer is airing a program called Inside LSD, and I hope they make it very clear that we were working with psilocybin. But Annie is featured in this program, and we did a recreation of a treatment session to give you an idea of what it was like for participants. So I'm just going to play this clip, and you can hear Annie tell her story in her own words.
People in this country don't talk about death. It's like when I would talk about it sometimes with people, they would go, oh, be optimistic. Don't talk that way. You're going to be fine. And you really need to look at it. And this is the perfect way to do it.
Specifically with the cancer study, we're administering psilocybin as a treatment for serious mental suffering. Certainly, individuals with advanced cancer often have significant levels of existential anxiety.
I had lost my faith because of anxiety, and I was just terrified. I was so anxious that it was hard to think about anything else. I was being irritable with my husband, Richard, when I was so anxious, and that was a very bad thing.
She was irritable and we were both stressed out. I'm not saying it was her fault. The dynamic of the interaction between us often led to quarreling.
We talked about my intention, and my intention was to learn to control my anxiety so I could enjoy the rest of my life, because I was not enjoying my life at all.
I'm there with the subject for the entire 6 hours. We take a standard hospital room, and my research coordinator fixes it up with wall hangings and fabric, so we really create a nice setting, and patients are kind of cocooned.
Lovely purple wall hangings, and they brought orchids. I was thrilled with that. And then I had one of my tankas, my favorite tanka, right at the foot of my bed.
And I advise them to go as deeply as possible into the experience.
As soon as it started working, I knew I had nothing to be afraid of, because it connected me with the universe. It was very gentle, and there were people right there if I got upset. Everything looked absolutely beautiful. I didn't see things that weren't there. With my eyes covered, I saw patterns and visions and sort of faces and things. I thought about being involved with the people I love, and I thought about things I would do with each one of them and things I would tell them. I had an amazing spiritual experience, so it reconnected me to the universe. I was lying on this hospital bed, and it felt like the bed had turned into a circle of hands that were holding me up. And I was being supported. They put on Ave Maria, and for some reason, that made me cry about what effect my death is going to have on my granddaughter. And they all came over and they just sort of put their hands on top of my hands. Didn't say anything, but they were just there. And it was very comforting.
Every hour we check in, see how they're doing.
I had to get up and go to the bathroom, and when I was washing my hands, I looked in the mirror. I used to have very long curly hair, and people thought I was so much younger than I was, and now I look my age, at least. So I went back into the room and talked to them about that. I sort of came to the conclusion that, well, yes, I look older, but with age comes wisdom and maturity, and I felt okay with it.
When we came back, it was like someone had put on a light bulb inside of Annie's head. She was literally glowing.
Also, for our cancer study, we're looking at the impact of our treatment on their overall quality of life.
After that session, Richard and I went to Hawaii, and we had a lovely time. It wasn't weighing on my mind. I started chemo again, and it went okay.
I mean, like everybody else, Annie has good days and bad days. And some days, you're in pain, you're nauseous, whatever it is from the treatment. It's not easy, and I really do believe that the psilocybin has continued to buoy up her spirits.
I wanted to spend more time with the people who were important in my life. And my relationship with my mother improved because I finally told her. She was very anti-drug. And I played a radio show that I was on for her, and we have gotten so much closer since I opened up that part of my life to her. I don't look ahead as far. At this time of year, I'd be ordering plants for the spring to put in my garden, but I'm much more focused on this moment right now. What we did, it probably would have taken me years of therapy. And I would recommend psilocybin treatment for anyone with a terminal or potentially terminal illness. It's incredibly helpful. It's more helpful than any other treatment I've ever had.
In the land where we begin to die, may we learn to live this day.
I'll conclude by letting you know that Annie died 2 weeks ago. And as we're sitting here today, her family and friends are gathering in Berkeley for a memorial celebration of her life. Annie was from New York, and her family took some comfort in thinking of this gathering today as kind of an adjunct to the celebration of her life. For just a moment, if we could pause and think about the people who have contributed some very valuable knowledge to the science of psychedelics, and the brave volunteers who are continuing to sign up for the active studies now. It's just maybe 10 seconds of silent gratitude for their contributions. And in honor of those participants who got that activist spirit, continue to tell the stories, share the stories that you heard here today, and thank you for allowing me to share with you today.
Hi, thanks for your work. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about
Where are you?
what, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
If you could talk about expectations that were set, especially for the naive participants, what expectations they came in with, and whether or not what you said to them, if anything.
Oh, very good. Great question. As I mentioned earlier, we were very mindful about, be clear, this was a study looking at existential anxiety in the face of an advanced cancer. We were very careful to communicate we're not trying to treat cancer or alter the course of that disease. We let people know that we were going to adhere to pretty high standards in terms of set and setting, that they would be expected to do some work in advance around intention setting. There was quite a bit of discussion about what the main thing that they wanted to be working on would be. And I learned in the course of doing this work, I've spoken about this, it's online if you want to hear it, but the friction between the requirements of hard science and psychedelic work. Psychedelics really push some boundaries in terms of minimizing variability and doing everything by the book in a scientific way. So I realized what it really takes is a deep respect for what science requires. You got to keep that integrity there, but you also need the skills of a DJ. So people were coming in with all different expectations, and we made every effort to meet them where they were and to listen very carefully about where they wanted to be. And at a certain point, regardless of your spiritual views, there is kind of a turning it over to the mushroom spirit and seeing where that's going to take them, and just holding, don't want to use too much jargon or cliches, but really just holding space. So they were educated about everything that was going to happen to them physically. You'll come to the hospital, you'll have a heart monitor put on, we'll take a blood pressure every so often, you'll have to fill out some instruments. We just tried to get a lot of clarity around intention and let them know that they would have a lot of follow-up support afterwards. Did that answer your question completely? Yeah? Okay, feel free if you want to talk about it some more later.
Thank you for
Yes.
sharing that with us. I was wondering if there was any difference in dose in the people who were naive versus those who had taken psilocybin before.
That's a very interesting question. Do you want me to go ahead and...
I have just a couple more that are sort of similar. Is there tolerance that develops, and do you know of any long-term physiological effects, even from a single dosing of psilocybin, which it seems from their actions and mood afterwards that there may very well be?
Let me see if I can tackle that one. Because this was the first psilocybin study with human subjects in this population, the hurdles that Dr. Grob and his team at that time had to jump were enormous, and they were very conservative. So the dose was a moderate dose. It was standardized, and it was pure synthesized psilocybin in order to minimize variability. And it was administered by body weight. So those folks who were heavier got a higher dose. I don't know. I've heard someone who's kind of in the know said, well, I don't know if body weight matters all that much. It might be brain weight. So, but that tells you how we did the dosing. I know that subsequent trials have gotten approval to use a higher dose, so that kind of trying to find that sweet spot. We didn't want to blast people into mystical experiences. We were sort of more interested in introspection. So this dose worked well for what we were doing. And let's see, can I remember, refresh my memory about the other parts of your question?
He asked about tolerance as well.
Tolerance, well, we only had one active session. And there were strict protocols around other substances that medications that they could be taking and so on and so forth. So for this particular study, we weren't really looking at that. And in terms of the long-term effects, it varied by individual. You've heard, firsthand people talking about anxiety being alleviated and that being sustained. When the data are good on this point, when the study comes out, you can see how measures of depression and mood and so on, placebo versus psilocybin, yes, it would be difficult to talk about the sustained effect because everyone was very different. Some people chose to stay in very close contact with us. Some people kind of had their session, and after the 6-month follow-up, I don't know so much after that period. So,
Alicia, what is a moderate dose?
pardon me?
What's a moderate dose?
For the purposes of our study, it was 0.2 milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
It turns out to be approximately what per whole person?
I'm
And
never quite
the next
sure
question
how
everybody
does
asks.
how does the psilocybin capsule translate to mushrooms? I would talk to one of the scientists. It's a popular question.
Okay. Other questions?
I was wondering if there are parallels between preparing for death and maybe preparing for somebody going to prison or being somebody who's having a loved one die, It seems like it could be, what's your speculation on any type of transition in someone's life?
You're playing the game we played when people were, deep in a session. Every now and then we couldn't refrain from kind of whispering to each other, like, what if we looked at, and these are great research questions. If you're inclined to be a researcher, I'd start thinking about drafting protocols. We did talk about what are next steps, what are some viable studies that could be done, and grief and bereavement with spouses is definitely one of the areas that came up. This is kind of a hard truth. This has never sat really well with me, but frankly, I think the widely held perception is that, as it has been in the past, it's a little easier for researchers to get permission to work with people who have advanced or terminal illness. And the thinking, I hate to say it, but it's kind of like, well, nothing else is going to help them, and I hope we move beyond that in the near future. But it's a wide open field. Draft your protocol, get your funding, hook up with a good institution, and take a look.
We have time for one more question.
Alicia, could you say anything about, you've talked about the transformers. Can you
Yes.
talk about the non-transformers and what you feel might be different?
Yeah, I would say in some way I could point to some incremental baby step that just about everyone took. The risk, and I'm just basing this on one participant in this particular study, the risk to avoid is someone who, despite what they may tell you in intake interviews and evaluations and so on, anyone who is looking for the drug to help them escape, who's looking for that high, if they're chasing, the fun they might have had back in the 60s at parties, if they're looking for the drug to pull them up out of the chaos and grief they're experiencing, it's not a good way to go. If they're looking to face what's going on head on and use the psilocybin as a tool, that works well. But having said that, the non-transformers were the minority, and I don't want to say more than I should, but it did seem in some cases that using the transdermal pain medication, like a fentanyl patch, may or may not have a blunting effect. That's another area of research that would be interesting. So most people at least took a baby step. Some people took a flying leap. Did I answer your question? Really? Okay.
Please help me thank Alicia Danforth.
Thank you.